No, today's daf is daf Mem Ches. Now we're talking about Kodshe Kodshim that require Shechita B'Tzafon in the northern part of the Azor. And the Mishnah records that Par V'Sar Shel Yom Kippurim, right? These were the special karbanos that went lifnai v'lifnim inside the Kodesh Kadoshim, and they certainly have the status of Kodshim, Kodshe Kodshim. Mirtei Tzafon Bi'ola Ksiv. The Gemara asks if you find Tzafon, that requirement of Tzafon, it's incorporated into the parsha of Ola. And therefore, since the original requirement of Tzafon is an Ola, it would have made sense that the Mishnah kick off with Ola. Nisnei Ola Bereisha. Why was it that the Mishnah began with Chatos, like, for example, the Sawyer or the Par of Yom Kippurim, and left out Karban Ola? Karban Ola actually is going to come up way later on, like 3 Mishnayos from now. So the Gemara answers, and we've seen this from Daf Beis in Shas, in Brachos, Chatos Aidi Diosi Vidrosha Chavivule. That which is derived from what they call biblical exegesis in fancy English is Chavivule, is beloved, is endearing to the Tana, meaning to Rabbi Yehuda Nossi when he edits the Mishnah. So he's going to change the Seder from the logical Seder, and he's going to put first that which is derived from a drasha. So the Gemara asks, "V'nisni chatos chachitzonios." Okay, so now you want to start with chatos. Why do you choose the chatos hapnimis? Why not start with chatos hachitzonis? And in fact, we're going to see that the equation between Ola and Chatos, from which we derive the requirement of Tzafon, is referring to Chatos Chitzona, not the Chatos Pnimis. So why do you kick off the whole discussion with Chatos Pnimis? And intuitively, I could almost anticipate what the Gemara is going to answer. I hope I'm right. That Chatos Pnimis, because of its special status, that it goes Lifnai v'Lifnim, and even that which is not in the Holy of Holies is in the Heichal, and the dam is put on the Mizreach Hazav, is that gives it a certain status. Let's see if the Gemara answers. Oh yeah, so there are 2 categories of chavivus here. One category of chavivus is the asi midrasha; it's derived from exegesis, and number 2 is if it's lifnai v'lifnim, that gives it a certain chashivus. Okay, so now kodshe kodshim we said requires shchita b'tzafon, and the dam has to be received by the Kohen, which is called kabbalah sadam, and the Kohen is standing in the tzafon. So the Gemara says, Tzafono bi Ola heicha ksiva. Let's go back to the parsha of Ola, which is the original parsha of Tzafon. And let's see what it says there. It says there, V'shachat oso al yerach hamizbeach tzafon. Now, if you take a look at the pasuk itself, although the Gemara doesn't quote the entire pasuk, let's quote the entire pasuk. It says, V'shachat oso al yerach hamizbeach tzafona. Okay, but actually, one pasuk before that, it says imenatzon karbano. So tzon is a reference to sheep and goats. How do we know that those chatos that come from parim, from bulls, also are included in the requirement of tzofan? Ashkan ben tzon, but ben bakar minolan. So the phrase ben bakar is a reference to parim, to cows and bulls and the like, cattle, what we call cattle. And how do we know the cattle requires shchita b'tzafon? So it's very interesting that the Gemara doesn't assume that by virtue of the fact that it's classified as a chatos, that itself includes it ipso facto in the requirement of tzafon. No. Maybe there are different animals that have to be brought, and maybe in the case of certain animals, like, let's say, for example, a par, maybe the Torah doesn't require a tzafon. Omakra, the pasuk says v'im. Now look at that vav. The vav of V'im minatzon. Now keep in mind the v'im minatzon comes after the pasuk of of par, but it goes upwards. It goes in that direction, meaning that vav mosif al inyan rishon means the vav is going to tell you that that halacha that you see on the bottom applies to the top. So again, you would have thought that it goes only in one direction, that the vav tells you, if you have A and then B, that B should be a derivative of A. But now the Gemara is postulating that A could also be a derivative of B. We could derive halachas in the top one from the bottom one based on the connecting vav. The Yomod Elim Mitachna, the top one is now going to derive from the bottom one. The top one is par, and the bottom one is tzon. And we're going to derive from tzon upwards, kind of backwards, up to par, to tell you that par also requires shchit and kabbalah b'tzofim. Not everyone agrees to this principle called Vav Mosif al Inyan Rishon, that the Vav allows you to shed a new light from the bottom up to the top. In other words, Golem Afreya, retroactive to that which came first. Desanya, and now the Gemara wants to show you that not everybody accepted, it was not universally accepted that there is such a thing as an exegesis called Vav Mosif al Inyan Rishon Desanya. The Im Nefesh. Now, take a look. We have again the word v'im with the vav on the bottom. And this pasuk is in Vayikra Perek Hey. And it says, v'im. That's the trouble with the Gemara I have. They don't always quote the psukim. You know what? I'm going to get a chumash. I think it'll be a lot more meaningful if we see the pasuk inside. I have a feeling that this is the parsha of Parahelim Davashal Tzibur. Wait, but let me just reserve my judgment until I see the pasuk inside. Pasuk Yud Zayin. The im nefesh ki techta v'osa achas mikol mitzvah Hashem asher lo te'aseno v'lo yoda v'oshem v'nos avono. I'm sorry. This is the parsha of Osham Tolui. And what's Osham Tolui? He's got two pieces in front of him. One is Shuman and the other is Chalev. He doesn't know which is which. And he eats one of them. And he doesn't know if he ate the Chalev or the Shuman. So he has to bring a korban Osham Tolui. Behevi ayel tomim in atzon v'erkali Osham el Kohen and etc. v'chiper. Osham hu and so forth. So this parsha, which is Vayikra Hey Pasuk Yud Zayin, opens with v'im. Now, the entire parsha before that, which is the substance basically of a whole bunch of psukim here, the Pasuk Yudalid, Pasuk Tesvav, Pasuk Tezayin, that's all Me'ilah. Now, there's also a korban Osham if a person violates Me'ilah b'shogeg. And now the question is, can we derive halachos from Osham Tolui with the Vav Mosav al Inyan Rishon that we should light now deriving halachos in Asham Me'ilah, for Me'ilah? And the real issue is going to be what happens if you're not sure if you were Moel Behegdish. Like, let's say you had two objects in front of you, one was Hegdesh and one was Chulin, and you didn't know which was which, and you you benefited from one of the two, and it might have been from the Hegdesh. So you're in a totally situation, a suffix situation vis-a-vis Me'ilah. And the Brisa says the following. V'im nefesh, the vav of v'im in the opening pasuk of the parsha of Hashem Tolu. L'chayv al sofik me'ilos Hashem Tolu. Divrei Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva is going to use vav most of in Rishon, and the later tachton is going to shed a light on the Elyon, teaching me that even in the case of Me'ilah, if he has sofik chatichachs mishtei chatichos, meaning he has a Tolu situation, he brings an asham. So that means that according to Rabbi Kiva, there's an asham me'ilos shebal asofek as an asham Tolu. The Chacham Potrim, Chacham say that if he has a doubt as to whether or not he violated Me'ilah, he does not bring a carbon. My love, says Gemara, what's the argument? The root of the argument is Rabbi Akiva applies the principle, and he has it in his laws and rules of how to derive halachos from psukim, that vav mosavel in Yerishon, whereas the Chachamim rejected it. They don't have vav mosavel in Yerishon. Omer Papa, no, I'm not going to take it sitting down. The Kuyama, even the Chacham agree that we do derive Tachton from Elyon through Vav, most of El Yirish. By the time the Rabbanon have a problem because there's a Gzeira Shava. Nemar Khan, in the case of Me'ilah, it says mitzvos. V'nemar b'chatas chelev mitzvos. Now, what's a chatas chelev? Chatas chelev is a chatas that you bring in a case where you certainly did eat chelev. There's no doubt about it. Again, you didn't do it deliberately, but nevertheless you ate chelev. And now we have a Gzeira Shava that's going to, through mitzvos, is going to tell you that just like in the case of a chatos chelev, it's only a chiv in vade, when you know for sure that you ate chelev and then you bring the chatos, so too, in the case of Asham Me'ilos, which is covered Asham for violating Me'ilah, you only bring the carbon in a case where you're absolutely certain that you violated Me'ilah. When do we say that there is a carbon of Asham Talui? That's only in a case where you violated an Isur, which had you done it deliberately, and we knew for sure that you did it, you would be Chayiv Kares. But in the case of Me'ilah, there is no Chayiv Kares for Me'ilah, and therefore, Me'ilah is not going to be included under this Gzeira Shava. Because again, the Gzeira Shava takes me back to Chatas Chelev, and tells you that in Chatas Chelev we had a Vadai Kares, B'shogeg. Had you been a Safek Kares B'shogeg, you bring a Karban Asham Talu. But that's only because you're a Safek as to whether you ate Chelev and you Chayiv Kares. But in the case of Me'ilah, you're a Safek whether you violated Me'ilah doesn't generate Kares. Therefore, it's not included in this Gzeira Shava. So therefore, could be, says Rav Papa, very logically, that maybe the Chachamim accept the principle of Vav Mosav Alin Rishon until it is undermined by Gzeira Shava. So you have now in a battlefield, like it's Dodge, not the Dodge. I'm talking about a boxing match. So in the boxing rink, who do you have? You have a Gzeira Shava and you have Vav Mosav Alin Rishon. Who wins out? So the Chachamim hold that Vav Mosav Rishon is not powerful enough to defeat a Gzeira Shava. And therefore the Gzeira Shava is going to tell you that in Me'ilah, in a case of Safek, you don't bring an Asham Tolet. Rabbi Kiva, what does he hold? What do we derive from this Gzeira Shava of mitzvos? We're not going to derive the conclusion, as the Rabbanan would have it, that you're only going to bring an Asham Toli if it was an Avera which would generate kares. No. What we're going to say is that we need a chatas kvua. Now, what's a chatas that's not kvua? That's called a carbon olav yored. So, for example, if you walk into the mikdash b'shogeg, or you eat kodshim b'shogeg when you're tameh, so in all these cases of a tumah, we have a parsha of carbon olav yored, which is a variable that reflects his financial status. However, Lafuke chatos the tumas migdash v'kadoshav, that there's no such thing as a carbon osham toli in a case of an avera which would generate a carbon olaviori, because then it's not similar to chatos. For Rabbanon, ein gzeira shava lebechza. Once you have the gzeira shava mitzvahs, then you have to take it to its logical conclusion and don't exclude anything. Ein achinami, I'm going to derive from your equation between Asham Tolui and Chatos that you need a case of a chatos kvua that's not a carbon olaviori, but at the same time, we're going to derive from that same gzeira shava that there's no carbon asham toli on me'ilah because me'ilah doesn't generate kares, and it's not similar to therefore to chatos. Rabbi Kiva Nami, does Rabbi Kiva deny the principle of ein hekesh of ein gzeira shava lemechza? And the Gemara says, Enochinami, you're right. That the understanding of Rabbi Kiva in Gzeira Shava is identical to that of the Chachamim. Why does Rabbi Kiva then disagree? Savar v'im nefesh ksiv vav mosav Rishon. He holds that the vav mosav Rishon will reflect on the Gzeira Shava and clip the wings of the Gzeira Shava. So the Gzeira Shava now will not apply in Gansen straight across the board. It will only apply to that halacha that you need a chatas kvua as opposed to a toli on something that's not kavua, which would mean tumas mikdash b'kadosh. Oh, I forgot to say this. So Rabbi Akiva prefers a vav mosav al inyan rishon over and above a gzeira shava. Rabbanan Nami, what about vav mosav al inyan rishon? Haksiv v'im nefesh, which would seem to allow the Asham Toli to spill over upwards to Me'ilah. What is more powerful, Gzeira Shava or a Hekesh? So Rabbi Kiva holds that the Gzeira Shava. One second. Sorry. Rabbi Akiva holds that the Hekesh of Vav Mosav in Yerishon. I'm not 100% sure why he calls it a Hekesh, but anyway, that Vav Mosav in Yerishon is greater and overcomes the Gzeira Shava, whereas the Chacham, no, Gzeira Shava is more powerful than Vav Mosav in Yerishon. Again, eventually we're going to have to come to terms with the following question: what are the Rabbanan going to do with the extra Vav? But we don't know that yet. That's going to come way down on the line. Lo, the Gemara says no. The Kuli Alma Hekesh Adif. Rabbi Akiva is right if he assumes that Hekesh is greater than a Gzeira Shava. Yamali Rabbana, but the Rabbana would say the following: yeah, no, it's true that a Hekesh will trump a Gzeira Shava, but Tachlan Hu the Gemara Be Elyon. In this case, we're going to use the Vav Mosav Al Yerishon in one direction and one direction only. Instead of going from Tachton to Elyon, which would derive conclusions about an Asham Me'ilah of Suffolk, meaning an Asham Tolim, we're going to go from the top to the bottom. And the Vav Mosav Al Yerishon is going to mean that the Me'ilah Asham is going to shed a light on the what's called the Suffolk Asham, the Asham Tolim. Tachlanu the Gemara Me'elyon. What are we going to learn from Me'ilah? La'asham b'kesef shkolim. Okay, so this is the minimum amount that you have to spend on the carbon asham, and it's a minimum of kesef shkolim. Now, if we had a lot of time, we try to figure out how much is kesef shkolim. And basically, the bottom line is that according to the Chazon Ish, it's 38.4 grams of silver. Okay. Again, the value of silver fluctuates, so I don't know. So now the Gemara wants to know, why would I have thought that this requirement of kesef shkolim would not apply to an asham tolu? and that the requirement of shkolim of kesef shkolim only applies to meila, to the sham meila. Shelo tomar lo yeis feko chomer mivadim avado chatus bas danka feko osham bas danka. So what is the logic here that's the Havamina for which I need this Hekesh Lafuke? The Havamina was that in the case of an Asham Tolui, you have to bring at least two shkolim of Kesef, although a regular Karmachatos has no minimum value. So therefore, the Rabbanan saying that, you know what, as long as there are no, contradictions, let's apply the Gzeir Shavah. Rabbi Akiva, Hosvar Minole, how does he know that an Asham Tolui has to be a minimum of Shnei Shkolim Kesef? After all, we're going to learn that from the just 1 second. From the Hekesh. So the answer is that Nafkalemi Vizos Toras Osham. Now this opens up a whole new vista. Zos Toras Osham is Torah Achas Chol Hashamos. So we have an Hasham Me'ila, and we have a Karban Osham Tolui. And Rabbi Akiva is going to maintain that we equate all the Hashamos into one package to require that minimum value of Shnei Mos Kesef, of Shnei Shkolim Kesef. So that even though Shnei Shkolim Kesef is only written in the Parsha of Asham Me'ilos, we're going to derive Asham Tolui from Asham Me'ilos because it's Torah Chol Hashamos. However, the Gemara says that issue, that principle of Torah Chol Hashamos is subject to a great controversy. Ha'tenach leman de islay Torahs, but man de leslay Torahs mecha gomer. How could Rabbi Akiva derive the halach that an Asham Tolui has a minimum of Shnei Shkolim Kesef from the fact that it says Torah Achas L'Kol Hashamos? We're going according to Madi Yomi, who doesn't hold from Torah Achas L'Kol Shonos. Again, it's not really a kash on Rabbi Akiva, it's a kash on that Madi Yomi, how he's going to understand Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara introduces another Gzeir Shavah Gomer Bi'erkecha. Okay, so here we're getting into the parsha of Asham Gzelos, and we're going to equate now an Asham Toli with an Asham Gzelos, because the pasuk of Bi'erkecha, the word of Bi'erkecha, appears in both the parsha of Asham Gzelos and in the parsha of Asham Me'ilos. And we said that in the parsha of Asham Me'ilos, the Torah explicitly requires Shnei Kesef Shkolim, and therefore we're going to derive from that since it's Gzeir Shavah Bi'erkecha, then even in the case of Asham Gzelos, we're going to have that requirement. So the Gemara says, okay, that's Asham Gzelos. Teina Heicha the Ksiv Bi'erkecha, but Asham Shivcha Charufa the Lo Ksiv Bi'erkecha Michael Beimar. Right, we don't have Bi'erkecha in all the Ashamos, and you don't want to accept right now that Torah Achas Yeh L'Chol Ashamos Gomer B'Yayil Yael. Well, guess what? When the Torah specifies which carbon you have to bring, in the case of an Asham Me'ilos, the Torah specifies that's got to be an Ayal. I think we just saw it actually, right? The Hevi Ayal Tamim, etc., etc. And the same thing appears in the parsha of Shivcha Charufa. Again, what's a Shivcha Charufa? Let's go over it very, very quickly. it means that two people were partners in the honor of a Shivcha Knainis. One of them was Meshacher's half. The other was not Meshacher's half, and now she is owned by one of two owners who only owns half of the Shivcha. That's called the Shivcha Harufa. And if somebody has a relationship with her, then he's got to bring a Korban Osha. And since the Torah in the parsha of what's it called, of Asham Shivcha Harufa, the Torah says that it's got to be with an ayal. So too, we find the ayal is a requirement in Asham Me'ilos, and therefore that Gzeir Shav of ayal is going to teach me that you have to have a requirement of bare minimum of Shnei Shkolim Kesef. Frekti Gemara, Chatos Minolan de Boitz Tzofan. After all, Tzofan is written in the parasha of Ola. Where do we derive that even a chatos needs a tzofan? The chsiv, it says, "V'shachat es chatos v'kam ola," that the chatos should be slaughtered in the same place where the ola is slaughtered, which means in the tzofan. Ashkan shchita, kabbalah minon. How do we know the kabbalah sadam has to take place in the tzofan in the case of a chatos? And the answer is the chsiv, v'lokach hakohen midama, and he will take. Right, the shchita we said of the chatas has to be in the place of the shchita the ola, and then it says v'lokach. V'lokach, we've had this many times in Zevachim, is a reference to Kabbalah Sadam. So since the Torah mentions Kabbalah Sadam immediately after it mentions that the shchita has to take place in that same location as the ola, meaning tzofon, so too Kabbalah Sadam has to be in the shevet. Fekti Gemara Makabel Atzmi Nolan. How do you know that the Kohen who's being Makabel Adam, he has to stand in the north? Maybe he could stand on the border over the other side of the north and just stretch his hands into the tzofon and do the shchita or do the Kabbalah. I don't know why the Gemara asks about Kabbalah and not shchita. Das weiß nicht. But in any event, v'lokach lo yikach. This is called Sirus HaMikra, when you take a word and you cut it in half. So if you cut the word v'lokach, it's lo yikach. And lo is a reference to the Kohen. So not only is the dam received in a vessel in the tzofan, but also the Kohen who's receiving the dam has to be located his feet has to be on the ground in the tzofan. Ashkechan, now we derive the conclusion that a chatos requires tzofan, both in shchita and in Kabbalah. Okay, lemitzvah. But le'akiv minayin, how do you know that it's ma'akiv? Because ma'akiv is always contingent on the fact that the Torah repeats it twice. Shino lava kos v'le'akiv, krach rineksiv v'shachat oso v'mokom asher yishchad es ha'olam. And the Torah is referring to a chatos and has to be shechted in the place of the olah. The olah is shechted in the tzofan. So now we have two psukim that tell me the same thing. V'shachat es chatos mokom olah and shachat oso v'mokom asher yishchad es ha'olam. Why do we need two psukim? Shino lavakos of liakim to tell you that it's critical. Vesanya, we learned to the brisa Heichan Ola Nishchita Batzofan. Af Zev Tzofan, so too a chatos has to be shechted in the tzofan.